Good afternoon, and the very first thing to say is what a pleasure it is to see a lot of familiar faces. For those of you who'd not met me before, I'll just say a little bit about my own background. I was reminded of this because I was recently at a 30-year reunion from my own MBA program. 30 years. And what I did after finishing my MBA in the US was to follow a well-trodden path into strategy consulting. Are there any strategy consultants? Current ones, past and reformed ones here in the room, apart from me. We've got a number of strategy sinners or saints here in the room on the consulting side. What a lot of consultants, of course, do after a while is to roll up their sleeves and move across the great divide, and instead of selling advice, become buyers of advice. I moved into industry as group strategy director for a large multinational firm, and I have to say it was the perfect opportunity to get my revenge on my former colleagues from the Boston Consulting Group, as it happened, who were desperate to sell me very high-priced advice, which I was able to beat down ruthlessly. And then in more recent times, I've been here with all of you as a strategy professor here at London Business School. Now, when we come back to what strategy should be about, at least on a good day, it should be all around the question, what next? And what we would love as strategists would be able to realize those hopes for riding the next wave of performance, or even making that wave. We'd also like to be able to banish those fears. And fundamentally, that's the central question that we're looking to address as strategy people. Back in the day, what strategy people did was very much focused on formulating strategy. It was very much around the great strategic idea, the answer to the question, what are we going to do? My colleagues, who I've kept in touch with at BCG, at Boston Consulting Group, now say that what we called in the day, 30 years ago, the strategy, is now just the proposal. It's now just the proposal. You have to do the work, they were saying, in order to get the work. Because the answer to the question, where will advantage come from, how will we banish those fears and realize the hopes, is perhaps less now to do with the way in which we formulate strategy and more down to the way in which we execute, which is the theme I hope we can explore. But let's personalize it, because given that I've spent my entire career pretty much, 30 years of it in the strategy field, I feel pretty strongly about strategy questions. But what about all of us? For example, one way or another, how much time do any of us in the room currently spend on anything to do with strategy? How many of us would say we spend a lot of our time formulating strategy? Show of hands? Very interesting. Very interesting for a strategy professor who might have been teaching lots of good courses on strategy formulation. That looked to me like, how many hands went up? And again, it was a rather loaded question. What does a lot of time mean? But I don't think we had more than a dozen hands going up. How many of us in the room spend a lot of our time executing strategy? Show of hands. Now look around. So that does rather point, doesn't it, to what should be the balance in the curriculum. In other words, emphasis on the what, yes. 12 people put their hands up, but when we come back to the how, that's universal around the room. Over the next 5 years, looking ahead, how many of us would expect to spend less time on anything to do with strategy? More time, show of hands. And do you expect strategy to get easier or harder as you look ahead? Who'd say why? Why? Who'd like to kick us off? Why harder? Complexity. Complexity, if we define it, is all about interconnectedness, more connections. It's become a much more connected world on multiple dimensions, therefore much more complex. I do a lot of work with some of the large global professional service firms, but also in the London Business School context, with a range of firms, large, small, who come through our doors on our executive education programs. And pretty much universally, the answer to the question, will what got us here get us there is no, because of the way in which context has been changing. How many of us in the room enjoy sailing? Do we have any sailors? Oh, we've got a lot of sailors. Excellent. So what's happening in the picture? We've got the spinnaker up, and we would only put the spinnaker up if we had a good, steady, relatively gentle tailwind. Again, without wanting to overdo the metaphor, it may be that these are the conditions in which a number of us, a number of our leaders, a number of our organizations came of age. There's an economist that a number of you will have come across, Mervyn King, who is running the Bank of England, was Deputy Governor, was part running the Bank of England, who talked about the Great Moderation. And the Great Moderation, according to Mervyn, was the period which began in roughly 1989 and ran for nearly 2 decades, in which measures of volatility, by just about every count, got greatly compressed. In other words, we were finding that there was the same steady wind behind all of our boats. And we could see out into the distance in this picture because it's rather a nice day. Of course, then the weather changed, didn't it? How many of us believe that gentle tailwinds are about to return? That's called a rhetorical question. Mind you, you have to be very, very careful with forecasts. And I can't resist here stealing a line from a very good friend and colleague of mine, who I'm sure many of you know, Andrew Scott, macroeconomist, who indeed worked very closely with Mervyn King at the time the notion of the Great Moderation was being formulated. And some of you may have been taught by Andrew the 3 rules of forecasting. Rule number 1, if you make a forecast, never give a number. You can say it's going to go up or it'll go down. If you give a number, never give a date. Because one day you'll be proved right. Whatever you said, this is sometimes called the stop clock theory of forecasting, and we've seen a lot of use of that made recently by British politicians. And the 3rd rule of forecasting is, if you give a number and a date, then never come back. Now, in your organizations, I'm sure you'll talk about a range of megatrends which are shaping the future. And of course, the picture in emerging markets, which many of us would have been blithely optimistic about as drivers of growth a few years back, looks rather rocky at the moment. But it would be ridiculous to say that there's no headroom for growth left in China, India, and Brazil. It's much more a question of when we see the return. But of course, it's going to be a very rocky ride, isn't it? We're not going to be looking at smooth patterns of growth in emerging markets. There'll be many capacity bottlenecks. It's going to be a stop-go process, or a go, stop, go back, go forward process. In other words, we're looking at a pattern of growth looking ahead, but probably highly disruptive growth. We see social transformation. This is a McKinsey forecast looking at a more than doubling of what they call the global middle class. And we could continue to extend the list. But fundamentally, all of those we could regard as being drivers of growth, but at the same time, drivers of growth and disruption. There's some interesting work that's been done at Harvard on volatility, looking at the dispersion of profitability between firms in given sectors across cycles. And what stands out is what we might intuitively expect, which is to say that in the era of the Great Moderation when there was the gentle wind coming from behind, propelling all boats pretty much evenly, the variance of profitability became very low. In other words, the gap between winners and losers in given sectors became much less than in periods of higher volatility. Higher volatility, much more dispersion of profitability, much bigger gap between the winners and the losers, all around the opportunities and threats and who's going to seize them or avoid them first and fastest. So the holy grail of strategy was always sustainable competitive advantage. And what's the issue here? Not that competitive advantage is irrelevant, but that much of what we used to rely on If we come back to some of the classic language of strategy, we talk about the ability to succeed because we create value, we capture value at the same time, and this is suggesting that the rules for value capture and value creation are going to be changing much faster. So a given competitive advantage will not be to the same extent a rock on which we can build our whole corporate edifice. A lot of the work I'm doing with professional service firms is exactly around this, which is welcome to a different world. Welcome to a different world. We may, as magic circle firms in law, have felt that we had a rock-solid advantage, customer lock-in, but in fact, even the nature of what the legal sector is starting to converge, convergence, volatility, which those of you who put your hands up have been dealing with for many a year, also now come right to the fore for all of us. Sustainable competitive advantage. I think we now have to talk about transient competitive advantage. So the issue then is how we renew. So back to the sailing conditions. Where's the wind coming from now? Over the last 3+ years, we've been running a research initiative, which is also a learning initiative, on where advantage might lie in terms of how we execute. So we run a 1-week executive open program. We typically take about 30 senior middle managers at a time, and as well as running a course, we also collect data. What we do is to ask each participant ahead of time to carry out a 360-degree survey effectively on execution in their own organisation around some themes, which I'll share with you very shortly. So effectively, this is allowing us to identify execution bottlenecks, to see what patterns can be seen across different sectors, looking at what might make it really difficult in this more turbulent world to get our crew to move fast across the deck of that boat and pick up the sounds of the waves breaking on the rocks in the distance. From the old days, there are some myths, or let's say biases, if we were going to be kinder, in strategy execution, which we believe need to be countered. The first myth that we are looking to tackle is the idea that execution is really about vertical alignment. So here's the golden thread where we define the strategy, the vision, if you like. It gets embedded in the plan. We would then define KPIs, individual and team objectives, and then we'd provide some feedback on performance. Does anyone lived in an execution model of this kind? Now, let's be clear. There is a place for vertical alignment. What we're talking about here is undue emphasis. In one organisation I work with, they talk about cascading the strategy. Have you ever heard that term? Cascading the strategy. I find it's very interesting to examine these metaphors that we use in business life. What in real life is a cascade? It's a waterfall. What direction does the water go in? And if you're standing underneath the waterfall, you get very wet and rather annoyed. So immediately there's questions about reversal of the flow. But there is such a strong bias in so many organisations towards this. And what we believe is that it comes from an underlying view of hierarchy, because if we think of a firm as a hierarchy, then very naturally we'll think of execution as vertical alignment, because we'll have been relying essentially on organisation design to do the job for us. Now, we've already identified one concern, which is this is all one way. But what else might be an immediate concern that leaps out at us as we look at this? What's missing? Yeah. So here we're asking questions about horizontal coordination. How are we making those links across, not just the links down the vertical chain, which starts to be crucial, doesn't it, if we're looking to create solutions, which typically involve connecting different product and service arenas. It starts to be crucial for innovation, which typically is about boundary crossing. And indeed, if we're missing horizontal coordination at that level, then we may find that our ability, for example, to work with others becomes severely limited. But using a different lens, we asked ourselves, what would it be like if we saw the organisation as being predicated not so much on power, but on commitments, promises. And what you've got here on the screen is simply a download from Facebook. You can plot your map of relationships as Facebook would see them pretty easily. Any relationship that has any meaning carries with it some degree of commitment, which is about promises, and it's about promises that bring about trust. And it could well be that the crucial carriers of performance commitments in our organisation have very little to do with the formal hierarchy. And of course, those commitments would go beyond firm boundaries, and we'd already touched on this. How many of us in the room know ARM, based in Cambridge? I find this a fascinating organisation. It's one of the UK's rather rare technology success stories. If you have an iPhone, or a Samsung Galaxy, or any handheld device, inside it you will have ARM technology. Effectively, ARM technology, ARM technology, is all about the chipset that governs power consumption and enables low power consumption, so you don't have to have one of those huge batteries that you see in movies about mobile phones from the 1980s, and your phone doesn't burst into flames as it might with high power consumption. So ARM indeed do create these designs, but it goes much further than that, because ARM, around those designs, create and manage an ecosystem. And it's an ecosystem which, in many cases, involves no transactions. No money is changing hands. However, the effective coordination and cooperation of those ecosystem members is absolutely critical for ARM's success. But none of them actually work for ARM. In other words, we've moved beyond, if you like, the hierarchical model to one which is about influence. So the OEMs might, for example, be Apple. And so then the question would be just how good a job are we doing at the horizontal dimension of alignment, not just within our organisation, but beyond its walls, because I'd argue that many of us, if we're going to succeed in this world of transient competitive advantage, will indeed need to be highly effective in working swiftly with others outside our own boundaries. So we'd mentioned that everyone coming on that programme, Executing Strategy for Results, completes a 360-degree survey. And one of the questions is, who can I rely on? Who delivers the goods? I can rely on X to do what he or she says they will, all of the time or most of the time. And it turns out that people can rely on their boss about 85% of the time. Direct reports, about 83%, probably because they wouldn't stay direct reports for very long if the score was rather lower than this. But then when we come to colleagues, and we're talking here about colleagues in other units, and partners meaning partner organisations, then we're talking about a much lower degree of reliability. Now, just stress, this is aggregate data, and it starts to get even more interesting when you break it down by sector and by geography. But it's coming out of roughly now 8,000 respondents from about 300 companies. And if we do need horizontal alignment, this starts to raise some very important questions in terms of what we're doing or are not doing. Now, from our own personal experience, what happens when we can't rely on our colleagues? DIY, does that ring bells around the room? Now, what else might we do? You're not getting any cooperation from him, and it's a crucial project, and you know you're going to be judged on the success of that project. He doesn't work for you. What will you do?
Talk to his boss. Talk to his boss.
Ah, right. So this we call escalation. Escalation, which in some organisations seems to become a primary strategy execution tool for that reason. So as we escalate to his boss, then you're going to escalate to her boss, presumably, and then they'll escalate to their bosses, and then life in the boardroom is going to start to get really depressing because what we'll be doing up there in the boardroom on the executive committee is dealing with these endless escalations. On a bad day, what we might do in order to deal with this is to say, I've had enough of the escalations, so now we're going to have a proper plan to deal with it. which makes it absolutely clear what everyone's job is and what they're expected to contribute. The problem? I believe the correct quote from Count von Moltke, who reformed the Prussian army, is no plan and survives first contact with the enemy. So again, we won't be able to address this by relying on the plan, will we? So then the question might go further, which is, what is fundamentally our execution challenge? And this, we believe, is one of the major sources of confusion, which is to say, in some cases, the important challenge is coordinating across units, but not always. For example, if we're trying to do a turnaround, disaggregation may be very important. It's no coincidence that PE houses, private equity houses, that essentially look to do turnarounds, look to keep units very separate, not least because eventually we want to sell them and we don't want to have created a tangled web which will make it extraordinarily difficult to unplug an invested business. The question there is, as we coordinate more effectively across units, do we also then become somewhat less flexible in terms of being able to adapt to shifting circumstances? So one of the key questions is which of these is going to be most important, because all of them are in fact in tension. It's not going to be possible realistically at a given point in time to be a superstar on all three of those dimensions. It could be that the balance shifts over time. Nokia, not the old Nokia, but the new Nokia, the old Nokia Siemens networks, as it were, and the leadership challenge there was to call the change, which is to say the execution priority has been, during the darkest days of Nokia's underperformance, has been indeed all about vertical alignment. But now we've done the Alcatel deal, what we're looking to do is to shift gear, because coordination across what we've created with Alcatel-Lucent, the solutions that we might be providing, has become the crucial piece. So for any of us in the room, it might be worth keeping in mind that question. What is the execution challenge primarily now in our organizations? And how might we see that shifting as we look ahead? Here are a few more myths. The third one might strike you as odd, because a lot of organizations put huge efforts into communicating strategy. One senior middle manager of a company that will be nameless said, actually, he needs to understand the strategy. Said, I need to understand the strategy, but it's my job not just to pass on the PowerPoint, it's my job to translate the strategy into a set of executable priorities. Because the issue is not, have I seen the bubble charts and the 2x2 matrices, nor is it about some level of understanding about how we're here to make the world a better place, important as that is from the standpoint of emotional buy-in. But my question, if you want me to execute your strategy, is just what is it that you want me to do? And why does it matter? And who else does it matter to? So in other words, if we're coming back to the question of coordination, the horizontal coordination, again, back to what you want me to do, who do you really want me to do it with? So this would then come back to the theme of priorities. Let's say priorities rather than the strategy. And the organizations we were working with pretty much all have employee engagement surveys. Often the employee engagement surveys have something like what we see in the top box here. Do you agree with the statement, I am clear on the firm's top priorities? And then what we find from the sample is that 84% of managers agree with that statement. We asked the same managers to list the company's 5 top priorities. Actually, it was the priorities for their own unit. Less than half of direct reports could list 2 of the 5. This, by the way, might be a very interesting exercise for any of us to carry out, because even before we get to the how do you want me to do it and with whom, just what might those priorities be? Without wanting to be awfully depressing, we kind of made it a little bit easier. Rather than the top 5, how many of you can get the top 3? And again, in this sample of now 8,000 people or thereabouts coming from some illustrious companies which might even be represented in this room, who knows, we were finding that if you just made it one priority, you'd get a somewhat higher hit rate. And you saw on the slide a little earlier that rather forbidding German character, Count von Moltke, who reformed the Prussian army after a disastrous defeat at the hands of the French. Who are the French people here in the room? Excellent. So this was the Battle of Jena. The Battle of Jena, and you have the Pont Jena by the Eiffel Tower, I believe. And this was where Napoleon defeated the best army in Europe, the Prussians, because they were the best trained. They could march in time better than any other army. They could shoot more accurately. They were the best, but they were smashed. And in the examination of the ashes that followed, an insight, which was a very important insight, not just for military history buffs, but in this context, around the quality of commitment, was that the Prussian army had been trained very much on the basis of what Moltke called Befehlstaktik. Befehl translates from the German as an order, Befehlstaktik. So the notion was that you'd be given an order and you'd pass it down the line. The problem then arises in the fog of war when the chain of command is broken. As a sensible soldier, what do you do when no more orders are coming?
Wait.
You stop, you wait. So the question was, could we move, in terms of the nature of the commitment that was being asked, from Befehlstaktik to Auftragstaktik, which when the Auftrag would be much more defined as, there's still an element of command in it, but it's the level of purpose. It's providing the reason why. So if we understand the reason why, and if we have been trained to understand the reason why, then when the chain of command is broken, what might we be able to do? Think and adapt. Also, we learn the skill of not cluttering our subordinates with too many commands. In other words, we're able to ensure a much better signal-to-noise ratio. And those reforms around Auftragstaktik were fundamental in re-energizing that particular organization with somewhat mixed blessings, some decades later, of course. But it would come back again for us to the question, when we're talking of priorities, do we have an understanding of the what? Are we providing some tools for the how? And have we also addressed the why? Because let's be clear, in turbulent environments, we're not going to get it right all the time, are we? But what we do want is to have large numbers of people, assuming that our organization has large numbers of people or our ecosystem contains large number of people, making more or less the right decisions most of the time. And given the challenges of turbulence, if we can pull that one off, then we will have built a very powerful and much more sustainable source of competitive advantage. Now, here's a fourth miss. Sometimes execution, I've found, gets confused with operational excellence. Operational excellence is doing the thing right. But as well as doing the thing right, there's the question of doing the right thing, which brings us into the theme of resource allocation. And this chart may be a bit of a sight test for those of you at the back, but it's a summary of what, to me at least, is some very interesting work done by Stephen Hall at McKinsey, looking at the implications of dynamically allocating resources from year to year, or simply sitting on your hands as a resource allocator. So the comparison is to do with the degree to which your allocation of CapEx, capital expenditure, is essentially the same as what you've got last year. If that's the case, the correlation index will be up at 1. The lower it is on that chart, the more we find that you won't necessarily have the resources that you had allocated last year. This is about capital spending, but it could be about IT and it could be about talent. And from this survey, which is called How to Put Your Money Where Your Strategy Is, the evidence is that if you are not a dynamic resource allocator, then your performance measured here as TSR, total shareholder returns, is likely to suffer. So not surprising, as new opportunities and new threats emerge, the question again is, are we biting the bullet? in terms of having the tough conversations about resource reallocation, because, again, this is a line taken from Stephen, in many companies, investments like war, which is to say it's easy to start one. And in their survey, in the McKinsey survey, typically middle managers said not much of a problem getting hold of resources, particularly if we built up a bank of credibility over time. But what is the problem with war? It may be easy to start one, but very difficult to get out of one. So here was the crucial question around exiting too slowly or struggling to exit. And it's not just about the waste of resources, but it's also about the emotional wear and tear. So you've got some initiative which should have been painlessly put to sleep years ago, but it's someone's baby, and you're the person who's now got to say, I'm sorry, it's an ugly baby, which again starts to come down to the kind of discipline that we're going to need as that portfolio of opportunities, new opportunities and new dangers starts to shift. Now, performance culture. How many of us in the room would like to have a performance culture in their organizations? So we reward performance. Show of hands. We like that because we want people to score those goals, don't we? If the challenge is fundamentally vertical alignment, then what we typically call the performance culture, where we're rewarding individual performance down the hierarchy, could make perfect sense. But what we found, again, in our survey, in our execution survey, was some disturbing results. So, for example, considering adaptation, of the roughly 8,000 managers in the survey, more than half were saying that experimentation and failure had hurt their career, at least to some degree. Does that ring bells? Then, when it comes down to coordination, 15% was saying that issues got addressed promptly if it hit their numbers, but otherwise, if you want to follow the gypsy's warning, get your own job done first before you start collaborating with others. And then 2/3, regardless, by the way, of whether or not this was identified as the challenge or that, but 2/3 of the people in the sample were saying that individual performance was the top driver of promotion decisions. So again, we would want to come back to the classic question, what are we really seeking to achieve? Then what are we really seeking to measure? Then what are we really seeking to reward? Here's the final one. The problem? You don't. What we're after here is identifying what we've been calling the distributed leaders in the organizations of those who are coming on this program and taking the survey. And I like the last one, Steve Jobs' test, which is if you were leaving for a new company and could take 100 people from your current company, who would they be? The importance of this is that the distributive leaders, back to that web, that network of commitments, are those who are commanding the key nodes. They're often the cross-pollinators. If we're talking about the translation of the strategy into executable priorities, they will very often be those who are doing that. They'll be the people who, in fact, are effectively collaborating with other distributed leaders across your organization if we've got the what and the why and the how of the priorities clear. So, again, where we might find, once more, in a highly turbulent environment, execution falling down, is where we've simply looked at the organogram from the top, rather than identifying who are the holders, not necessarily of organizational power from a structural sense, but who are the holders of influence. So just in summary, if we're looking at the relatively new world, which is not a new world for many of you in the tech sector, where volatility and uncertainty and complexity, ambiguity, the VUCA world has been around for a while, but more and more of us, I believe, if we're not doing so already, we'll have to ask ourselves just to what extent are we building an execution advantage by moving from what may have served us perfectly well when we had the wind behind us and the spinnaker on our boat up, to what's now going to serve us, I hope, in a world that's much more much more turbulent. If it is a world that we've got to discover progressively, rather than thinking about the linear approach to strategy, my colleague Don Sal talks about replacing lines with loops. And the notion of the strategy loop is that the first part of it is about making sense of an ambiguous situation. Then from making sense, the question is making choices. What are we going to do? Not do? What are we going to stop doing? From choice, we come to commitment, which is all about the tough discipline that means that the choice we've actually made really has some teeth. What do we have to do with the top left? Close the loop. So this is where we're making revisions, and the key here to my mind, and this is back to the leadership challenge, is that these are very different conversations. They're very different conversations. Let's remember, unless we're at the sharp edge in our organizations where we're physically coding software or using screwdrivers and hammers, the only tools we have are words. When we're making choices, this is where we want to have a debate with people taking up a position and arguing for it and defending it. When we want to make it happen, the debate is over, and this is about what's the nature of your commitment. Is there a good promise happening here? Conversely, is there a good ask? The tone when we're making revisions, the wheels have come off the wagon, didn't work out as expected. What's the worst thing we can do at that point? The blame game. The blame game. Way back, the Boston Consulting Group, where I worked, had a tool that they called the experience curve, and the notion was that as you gained experience, you'd improve on cost or on technological discovery, you'd move down the experience curve. But if you indulged in the blame game, what would be the slope of the experience curve? It would be absolutely flat, because there'd be no learning, and therefore no competitive advantage. The final point is really this: when we come back to success, is it about the hand we had dealt, or is it about the way we play the hand? And this session's been really pushing very hard for the way we play the hand to be the source of competitive advantage rather than market position, the resource-based view that you took in your core strategy course at LBS. So I hope this has been useful and interesting, and I have to say it's been a real pleasure to reconnect. Wonderful to have you back.